In October 1984, more than 40 women met in the front room of Women's House, sitting on the floor and spilling out onto the veranda because no one expected such numbers. They were a diverse mix of women in terms of age, skills and background, but all shared a common agenda for much needed positive social change. The organisation was founded in a generally deeply conservative political climate. During the Jelke-Petersen era, many freedoms and liberties that we take for granted today didn't exist. Attending a rally would place you at risk of arrest for illegal marching, and gatherings of more than 5 people were forbidden without a police permit. Women's rights as human rights were far from a given. Undeterred, the founders courageously and doggedly pursued their then sometimes unpopular goals of ensuring women had access to justice, changing systems and laws that were not serving the needs of women, and ensuring a safe space for women to come together.
So it was a particularly negative and conservative world, and it was a particularly bad world for women and children. There was a lot of unspoken pain, I suppose.
And it was a really fascinating time to be a female writer with a voice, because honestly, so few women in the state really had a voice at that time, a voice that was being heard and that was being taken seriously. It really took me back quite emotionally to just how challenging and kind of dreadful those days were.
Anyone who was anyone had a special branch file, and anyone that, the police did keep tabs on people who were seen as being problems in the community about stirring things up. It was a difficult time for social protest. It was a difficult time for changing the way things are. But there were so many people who wanted to change. In fact, a lot of people didn't want to come to Queensland from New South Wales because they were scared of what might happen to them in Queensland. Those of us who'd grown up here, it was just part of the environment.
There was violence at some of those demonstrations, and I became, quite light on my feet to avoid getting arrested, because that wouldn't do too well for my law degree and admission as a solicitor. And I remember once my mother calling and saying that one of the women who lived in the same set of units as her said, "I saw Di on TV again." There were police just all around her. So that took a bit of explaining, but you just had to do it.
It was 1985, and the government of the time, the Jelke-Petersen government, had a very, very, very conservative view of reproductive rights for women. And what happened was that the government raided the Greenslopes abortion clinic and took around about 20,000 files of women who had accessed the clinic and had pregnancies terminated. And to me, and to so many women in the state, that was almost unbelievable. Even talking about it now, it was an unbelievable time that women were so poorly regarded and their rights so completely diminished that a government of the time thought that was okay.
In 1984, when the Women's Information Service was established, the federal government had been made aware by women in Queensland of our need to have that information. It was only in 1966 that the marriage bar was lifted. Imagine being told, "Oh, you're getting married, how wonderful, you're sacked,"
So I started in a legal firm in 1975, and I was doing a lot of matrimonial work. That was under the old Matrimonial Causes Act, where you had to prove that there was a fault. Someone had to prove that the marriage had broken down, and you needed evidence. Most of them were on the grounds of adultery and you had to prove it. What they used to do was they would hire photographers to follow their spouse, who was the adulterer, who had previously been found out by a detective. So they had to hire a detective, find that they were committing adultery, then get the photographer, and then get the evidence. There were a series of photographs from which the judge would infer there had been adultery. Now, the photographers were usually employed photographers at the Telegraph, which was an old evening paper. The difficulty with that was, if it was a well-known person, suddenly all of the facts of the case would be in the papers. So the divorce cases were open to the public, and so often these photographs would actually end up in the newspapers, or there would be evidence of, say, cruelty, which would usually be domestic violence. So it was expensive, difficult to get. You had to prove someone was at fault. It would take a long time, and then it was very publicly demeaning. And it was all about maintaining the institution of marriage.
There were no women at all at judiciary level, no magistrates, no judges. So the prospect of any enlightened approach to women under the law was non-existent, really. A lot of judges were decent men, but they weren't open to issues about, like, domestic violence, why women don't leave because they're terrified to leave or can't afford it. And they weren't aware of the influence on children of domestic violence in the house.
What was needed was a service where women could feel comfortable, women who'd had terrible experiences, so that really meant a specialised service, and preferably by women for women.
One night, and I was going off to lectures with Kate Holmes. We were studying women's studies, and I used to pick her up. One night, I was just chewing her ear off all the way home about how Brisbane really needed a women's legal centre because women just didn't have access to legal information and advice. So I decided I was going to call a meeting and discuss it. The first meeting, where there was over 40 people, women, in the room at Women's House, it was just such an amazingly optimistic, enthusiastic and passionate gathering of women. So it was really wonderful to be in there.
It was October and it was a hot night, and this is absolutely no aircon at all. And I remember just the mix of people, the crush, the fact that we couldn't physically even fit in a room. And actually, I don't even remember exactly what was said or what was resolved that night, perhaps because I wasn't in hearing distance or don't remember 40 years later. But it was an absolute sense of purpose and solidarity and, you know...
Excitement even?
Yeah. That it was going to happen.
I've always thought that it was a room full of overalls and boots, pearls and high heels. And that was what happened. And I have a memory of Helen O'Sullivan looking so very neat and proper, having, you know, come from a day at work as a lawyer, and like a few refuge workers sitting around with various piercings and tattoos, and feeling like people came from the kind of opposite ends of where it is that we might want to be helping women, and yet everyone in the room was absolutely clear about the need to actually do something about setting up a women's legal service. I don't think we had much doubt about that we needed a women's legal service in Queensland and that we should start now. And that's what we did.
As a former social work student at Brisbane's first community legal service, Caxton Street, so I understood how community legal services operated and saw the role for social workers as well as lawyers, and drawing on the potential for volunteers as well to provide access to legal and related assistance for people who wouldn't have otherwise had access to the law.
So I think that one of the great strengths of Women's Legal Service from very early on was that we by the nature of how that meeting got called and where it was held, the room was full of lawyers and social workers and other women who weren't lawyers, who were determined to get very involved and were determined for the lawyers to understand that for a women's legal service to be successful, it couldn't be just run by lawyers.
I don't think we could have done our job without the support of social workers. The legal issues that people present with is only a small fraction, and people need help with their whole life. They don't need help with just this one little sliver. But I think that that's why we could do what we could do. And I think it's also really healthy. We've always made sure at Women's that their management committee reflected much broader things than just lawyers.
There was no doubt that it was going to be a feminist organisation. I would say everyone there was a declared feminist. Like any other movement, there were some more radical than others. There was also a feeling too, I think, that legal advice, yes, of course, but that also there needed to be a voice for law reform and community legal education on women's legal issues.
It was not a popular idea, to say the least. It was considered very left-wing, radical, anti-men, lots of things. It was not easy at the time, was not welcomed.
I remember so well the establishment of the Women's Legal Service. It was something that was so needed in our state. 40 years ago, on the verandah, an old Queenslander, women got together to talk about this very important decision that they'd made. There was such a need for such a service.
And I had a list of objectives that I saw were necessary, and one of those was demystifying the law for women so they could understand the law without using legal jargon, having a list of practitioners that women could be referred to who weren't going to patronise them and who were going to treat them properly, about giving them advice, referring them to people, because women didn't have access. There was inadequate legal aid, there was inadequate court processes to deal with something like domestic violence, and you know, from a feminist point of view, I thought that things could change a lot to allow women to engage with the legal system.
In terms of getting the information out, there was a newspaper article, I think, with Anne Warner, and then we did a memorable paste up one Saturday night, and you know, I never saw myself as doing a paste up.
No,
and
I certainly never told my mother about that.
And I guess it's just that, you know, I mean, my background, I came from conservative country, Queensland. Right here, I'm doing paste ups in the valley in the Bjelke-Petersen era.
I think it was for a fundraiser or something.
Well, I think that was to advertise the service, that it was actually opening, you know, and how to contact before the first Christmas. But this is 40 years ago, so, you know.
Well, I drove the car because I thought, if I'm going to, you know, I can always drive off and leave them if the police don't.
And so I took the first calls over the Christmas break. So I did that in a way just to kickstart what we were aiming to do.
We certainly at first received a lot of questioning about the idea that we were going to give legal advice by telephone. And that was from extremely early on, the idea that legal advice could be given by phone. Nearly all of those organisations now have huge, you know, call centres where people are given legal advice and legal information by literally hundreds, if not thousands of people all around the world. So one forgets that the simple idea of giving legal advice by phone was actually incredibly radical at that time. To make a phone call in 1984 meant to stand in your lounge room or in your kitchen on a phone that didn't move and make a phone call. So to do that safely, we also knew that that in itself might cause problems, which is why we also had a place that women could come to. But those protocols around safety and understanding those kinds of things were things that we were having to learn, because there hadn't been a lot of discussion about those kinds of issues.
I think the first time I heard the term domestic violence, I had a friend in the Queensland Police Force, a female officer, and we were talking one day about what she had noticed was an absolute increase in the number of crimes of violence against women. And she used the term domestic violence with me. And she said, I think you should do an article about this. We had an extensive library at Queensland newspapers, but in those days there was no internet, no nothing like that. So everything was newspaper clippings that the librarians meticulously filed. And I went in and I said to one of the librarians, oh, could I please have the file on domestic violence? And she went behind the scenes where all the files were kept, and she came back and she said, we don't have one. And it really shook me. The term was so new, the concept was so new in the media that we didn't even have a file identifying it as a problem.
Because of the founders and the work that they did, and all the people who worked in the early days of the service building its reputation, Women's Legal Service has always been listened to, I think, by government. Haven't always got what we wanted necessarily, but I think in the government and in both sides of politics there was a respect for how the service did things and how it spoke up, and the lived experience that informed what the coordinators and others were saying to government.
As an organisation, you know, the legal brains that were involved, the founders, the calibre of women who stepped up, these were women who had to be taken seriously. Their concerns had to be taken seriously. These were not women who could be branded, out of control rabble-rousers who were just out to stir up trouble. These were serious women.
The following year, 1976, was the commencement of the Family Law Act, the new Family Law Act. When it first started, there were no real courtrooms that were set up. There were rooms set aside in the old taxation building in Adelaide Street, where there were only 3/4 partitions, so everyone could hear what was going on. There were no rooms for interviews, so it all sneaked down to the floor below, which was the patents office, where no one ever went. So you'd pretend you'd be doing some research in the patents office, and you'd get your client to meet you down there, and you'd have a meeting at the back of the book stacks, because that was the only privacy you could get. So things were very makeshift in the early days of the family court.
Very significant law reform. We took the phone call from the woman who came to us seeking assistance in relation to, she had been cross-examined by her abuser in the family court. So she said, Angela, I was cross-examined by my rapist. When I was in the domestic violence court, they didn't allow that. When I was in the criminal court and he was up on rape charges, they didn't allow that, but they allowed this in the family court. So we took that forward, and Women's Legal Services Australia came on board with that. The laws were changed, and there's a whole legal aid scheme that's funded now to protect women in those circumstances.
I think it's interesting that the three of us all started from a point of doing the client work and providing the client advice, and all those hours that you spend on the phone listening to the stories of the women that phoned and the casework that we all undertook, whether that was in court or whether it was supporting people that were representing themselves. Hours and hours of work, those stories were always at the forefront of our minds when we were doing the law reform work.
And that really was the strength of the service because we took that forward in relation to our lobbying, advocacy and law reform. We were grounded in women's experiences that were coming through our service and our practice, and they were reflected, what happened to women and their experiences of violence was taken forward by us in a really genuine way. We advocated for for a domestic violence inquiry, but that ultimately became the Not Now, Not Ever. We advocated for an inquiry into the criminal code for women that ultimately became the Women's Safety and Justice Task Force.
And just to interrupt there, we advocated, I guess 20 years earlier than the Women's Safety and Justice Task Force about women and the criminal law, and got the Task Force on Women and the Criminal Code in 1999-2000.
All at the same time, working with Women's Legal Services Australia on constantly trying to get family law reform, constantly trying to get safety prioritised in family law, so at that national level as well.
We've talked about some of the synergies across those decades and the way each battle or each campaign really built on the previous one as we tried to progress incremental changes to the law and also the family law system.
I think the benefit has been to individual women, and I think the innovation that I'm most aware of is the new position where they have the financial advisors who are giving women control over their own finances. So if you've got control over your own finances, you've got so much that you can do. They're also helping to wipe debt, which is so important because that's such a burden to go forward with a debt, because you feel so encumbered and so unable to make fresh starts if you've got a debt. The ability to A, understand what your debts are, B, have a strategy to manage them or get them wiped because they were not ones that you entered into voluntarily is a huge thing. So I think it's giving women control, particularly over their own finances, is the key to so much.
Well, I guess there's increased awareness of domestic and family violence and better understanding of that, but sadly there hasn't been a decrease that's gone alongside that understanding. You would think that as a society we would be able to prevent domestic and family violence from happening in this day and age.
From a personal perspective, my grandmother, who died at nearly 103 a few years ago, travelled to Australia at the end of World War II as a displaced person from Italy, and arrived in Brisbane with 2 small children, an alcoholic husband, and didn't speak the language. And I think back about her, and as a small child, I saw her in what was unequivocally a domestic violent relationship, but yet it didn't have a name during that era. So I always think about my mother and I speaking about her as having made a wrong choice, for instance, and I think my grandmother felt very responsible for her choices.
So my name's Famin. I am a lawyer. Throughout my whole life, really, now looking back on it, my family was experiencing domestic violence, but it's not something that was talked about for much of my life. It's only really been in the public dialogue for the last couple of years. And even then, there's a really long way to go in terms of talking about it and understanding it. My mum migrated from Bangladesh with my dad, and she was experiencing domestic violence from the moment that she stepped foot in this country with a man that she barely knew. And so the first time that I tried to go to a free advice session at Women's, I went with my best friend. And so we rocked up to a free advice session that started at 5:30, and it's a drop-in clinic, so you can arrive anytime between 5:30 and 7:30, and theoretically you should be able to get some free advice. We arrived at 5:45, we stuck in traffic from uni, got there and basically got turned away because they were already full for that night.
And those advice sessions, when I first started attending all those years ago at the Annalee head office at the time for Women's Legal Service, were quite confronting, because you'd turn up as a little advice solicitor and there would be women already queuing up out the door hoping for a drop-in spot to see a solicitor, and you couldn't guarantee on the evening that they would actually see somebody. And so that was always quite confronting. You were really aware of the need in the community, and you were aware that sometimes that Tuesday night or that Thursday night was the only half hour or hour, I mean, it's quite emotional actually, that woman would have to safely access some advice. And so you were really aware of the need and your internal desire to give them as much of your time as you could. But when you were with them, you were always aware that there were women sitting outside in that waiting room, often with their children, also hoping to see someone. So it was this real conflict of trying to give them as much of your time as you could, but being aware that there were women out there literally 5 metres from you who also needed some of your time.
I hadn't even contemplated like that organisations like Women's are so under-resourced that they have to turn women away. Like, it hadn't even come to my mind. And so I was quite shocked that we got turned away. And the lady told us that we were the 7th group of women that got turned away, and that was only 15 minutes into the clinic for one night.
I experienced domestic violence in the house as a child, and I always understood what it was like for my poor mother. So when domestic violence started to be talked about in policy terms, I felt it, I knew it, and I was desperate that something be done to help women like my mother. So it was no mistake that I would find myself involved with an organisation that was actually trying to do something to help women like my mother.
Yeah.
When I think about the time that I had to reach out to Women's Legal Service, it was about 5 years ago, and I was struggling a little bit with the process of leaving my children's father, and quite an abusive relationship. I had 2 children at the time, and so I was just kind of like just going, you know, taking one step after the other. And I think reaching out to the Women's Legal Service for me was just another thing. And so when I felt quite safe, and I felt quite comforted by the person I'd spoken to on the other end of the phone. And that person almost kind of wrapped herself around me a little bit, in the sense of there was a really clear timeline, there was clear steps, there was a lot of information. I like a lot of information. I'll read a lot, or I'll talk a lot to different people, and to try and be able to truly understand what something is. And I felt like that's what I got on the other end of the phone from that particular person.
I think just like even just waiting in the waiting room and the way that we got triaged, it was very clear that it was a safe space and that people there understood what we were going through and that we weren't alone. I think after literally in my life, I had lived through that domestic violence situation for 24 years, and my mum even longer. And so if you think about everything that was going on for so many years leading up until then versus what was happening when we were about to leave, and what the catalyst was for us and for my mum to finally take that step of leaving, the real difference was having that external support and external validation, and knowing that there are people out there that understand what we're going through and who have an authoritative point of view in terms of what we need to do. And I think that external piece and having those external advisors was actually the difference between us staying in that situation for so long and then finally being able to leave.
The first thing that I would say to a woman that's experiencing violence is that you are worthy, because you are. And there are a lot of things that happen in life that tell you otherwise, and that's just not the truth. It's actually just not. We all are worthy. That's the first thing I would say. And then the second thing that I would say is that you build your community, you know, and you build those things that will keep you strong, you know, the little things that keep you strong, that you place along the way. And, you know, when I think about places like the legal service, the Women's Legal Service, those services are there to help us, you know, and to be there for us. And it's hard, and it's really difficult to be vulnerable and to be able to put yourself in a position where you go, I actually need you to know that I'm not well and that I'm not okay. I don't know you from a can of paint, but I'm about to tell you some things that are really quite deep and really quite personal. And if that phone call turns out to be the best thing, like it did for me, then amazing. and I suspect that it will for you too.
Yeah, it just means that my family and I are literally the most settled and most safe we've ever been in the course of, almost 30 years. And my mum actually, has her own place. She can actually feel safe in her own place. She can invite whoever she wants over. She has that empowerment and she's able to live that life without control.
So we talk about the 150,000 women who have received assistance from the service. I think it's important to know that so many of those women may not even be alive if they hadn't accessed help.
The ultimate legacy of Women's Legal Service would be to not need to exist, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, sadly, I don't think that's ever going to happen, but I think there's an incredible legacy in terms of the voice that they have given, the advice that they've given and the support they've given, the political and administrative policies that have come and changed, and the incredible conversations that are now in the public domain.
It's an amazing thing to be part of the Women's Legal Service family, because there is that common purpose and there are a lot of shared values in terms of how all of the people that are involved with the service understand each other and have a mission. I think that's really what I found when I came from private practice, that women's was a place where you could make a difference, a proper difference. I think family lawyers everywhere are making a difference in people's lives, but for me, the way that family law was practiced at Women's Legal Service was just the best way to practice it. And to be able to sit with women and then not have to charge them or think about 6-minute increments of charging, that was just a great gift. And you could actually connect with them and talk with them.
There's something really powerful about working somewhere where everyone has a united purpose. And it's a purpose that's so important because it's not like it's just a service. It is a service to the women we support and it helps them, but it helps us all. Like, women's rights are human rights. They're my rights. Every colleague I have, they're their rights that they're serving to protect. It's their experience in the community. So it's a shared experience as well as a shared commitment. These are our lives that we're saving.
What I would say about the Women's Legal Service is a huge congratulations, because you have moved with the times. You do an enormous benefit, and there's so much to be pleased about. The lives of women have improved.
All I can say is I know that it's made a huge difference to individual lives. I think that's the legacy, that, they say if you can change one person's life in your own lifetime, you've made a huge difference. But if you think about what the Women's Legal Service has done for thousands of women who've had a new start, who've been able to take their life into their own hands.
Every person can make a small change. If there's other people to pick up the baton and run with it, it's going to make a huge difference. I'm just so proud of the Women's Legal Service. I just remember Zoe, and when I would hear her on the radio, and I would just be so proud. Oh, sorry. I'd be so proud to hear her talk. You just be in the car, you'd hear them come on, they'd say something really compelling and you'd go, yay. And it's so amazing to think that the Women's Legal Service has achieved so much, but has given women a voice and has been a vehicle to get society to think about women in a different way.
One thing that I would say, which has got nothing to do with all the goodness of what we've done, but working somewhere like Women's Legal Service, having been a founding member and having stuck there for so long, some of the most important friendships in my personal life have come from Women's Legal Service, and from some of the women I met through being at Women's Legal Service. And that is the other thing about working with women for women, is the depth of friendships and relationships that you form that mean that when your life is in crisis, there are people that you can call who truly, truly care about you. And that's also, that's the gift back from that work.
But the legacy that they've created is a once in a lifetime. They picked a moment in time that they found a way to create a different life for women. And across the generations, they did something no one else had before. So I think it's unlikely to be replicated, but what we need to do is honour the sacrifices those women made by continuing to drive through their legacy, by building on what they made for us, by standing on that solid foundation and pushing forward.
It's the question is one of those moments when you realise that you are standing on the shoulders of greatness. Those women have opened a pathway in Queensland for an incredible organisation of advocacy. It was something that was important to them for societal change, something that was important because they identified a need. It's sad for me to sit here 40 years later and say to them that need is only greater than when you started, but it's an incredible opportunity to say to them, thank you. It started with a group of women saying, let's make a difference.
The 150,000 plus women to whom the service has provided assistance, most being victim survivors of the gendered crime of domestic and family violence, are 150,000 complete answers to those who question, why do we need a women's legal service? There was no way these women could have known back then just how far-reaching and impactful this meeting and their subsequent contributions would be. How inspiration from their courage and foresight would reverberate through future decades. Their legacy is Women's Legal Service Queensland. For her, with her, this is their story.